we're going to talk about Mark's Gospel, and I'm going to say some things about the Gospel in its entirety. So when you look at the opening of Mark's Gospel, and you could study all Gospels by way of looking at beginnings and endings. This is an old approach to text, and it's a very good one. When you look at the opening of Mark's Gospel, the incipit, you can see that there are some different versions of verse 1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, and some ancient versions, you should have a footnote to this effect, add Son of God. So this is Mark the narrator orienting the listener, because Mark's Gospel was originally oral, to the proclamation of Jesus Christ, Jesus as Messiah, and in some versions, Son of God. So I'm going to take the printed version of the NRSV text, which adds Son of God, to verse 1 of Mark's Gospel. And I'm going to look at the way in which Jesus is proclaimed in Mark, Son of God. So this is the declaration of verse 1. Then if you look at the end of the Gospel, remember beginnings and endings, you can see that the centurion has a role to play in the deployment of this particular term for Jesus, when in chapter 15, Mark gives an account of Jesus' death. The centurion, who is standing by the cross in Mark's Gospel, verse 39 of Mark 15, declares in the NRSV translation, "Truly this man was God's son." So you could look at the whole of Mark's Gospel as an inclusio, that is to say, something that encompasses the proclamation of Jesus by Mark, verse 1, as Son of God, and by the centurion in chapter 15 as Son of God. And what those two people mean by the term Son of God is different. The term Son of God means particular things to particular people at particular times. We can't simply say Paul's understanding of Son of God is just the same as Mark's. No, it isn't. So what does a pagan centurion standing at the foot of the cross of Jesus, dying in agony, mean by the term Son of God? You see, if you were to just read notes about Son of God in the world of Jesus' time, you notice that emperors are called Divi Filius, Son of God. Is the pagan Roman centurion making a declaration that Jesus has something to do with the emperor when he's looking at a dying Jesus on the cross? And the answer has to be no, he isn't. This doesn't look anything like a triumphant emperor, almost a demigod of the Roman world. So what is the content of the Roman centurion's declaration in chapter 15? And it must be something about suffering and dying. So, and I'll summarize here, I think that Mark's Gospel is a presentation of Jesus as Messiah, as Son of God, in the context of the whole Gospel, in which you get a portrait of Jesus suffering and dying. So the content of Mark's term, Son of God, is not triumphant, but rather suffering and death. And the way to look at that is to go to the central section of Mark's Gospel, Mark 8, 9, and 10. Where we find three repeated discussions of what the term Son of Man means. So if we go to Mark 8, for example, in Mark 8:27, the central of Mark is Mark 8, 9, and 10. Jesus is asking on the way to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, who do people say that I am? And some people say John the Baptist, some Elijah, still others one of the prophets, and he says, but who do you, plural, you disciples, say that I am? And this, of course, is something that he's been building up to through the first 8 chapters. They have been listening to his teaching, looking at his exorcisms, listening to his baptism if they were there. Do you see? So they are now confronted with this important question, who do you say that I am? Peter says the Messiah, but Jesus sternly orders them not to tell anyone about him. And instead of listening to Peter or the other disciples, he then begins to teach them, and he does this 3 times in Mark 8, 9, and 10, about the Son of Man undergoing great suffering, being rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, being killed, and after 3 days rising again. He says all this quite openly. So Mark 8:31, 32. Peter begins to rebuke him. Peter doesn't like this notion. Peter says, This can't be right. We've understood you as Son of God. We've understood you as Messiah. This notion of suffering is not right. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter. "You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And he then calls the crowd, the larger group of people, besides the disciples. He, as it were, is trying to include more people in the reception of his teaching. "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And so this teaching about following Jesus by taking up the cross, not following Jesus by being triumphant, this is the central teaching of Mark's Gospel. So just to go back to the term Son of God, if the beginning and ending of Mark is about the declaration of Jesus by different people to be Son of God, then the content of the term Son of God is given to us in the notion of the suffering Son of Man, which is the central teaching of Mark 8, 9, and 10. So this, I believe, is the way in which Mark's Gospel takes the term Son of God and gives it the content of the central part of Mark's Gospel, which is about Jesus' repeated teaching as he journeys to Jerusalem of the necessity of his suffering, dying, and then eventually being raised again by God. So this then is the way Mark structures the Gospel. It's a Gospel, if you like, of suffering and dying. It's a Gospel that is incomprehensible to most of the disciples. It's a Gospel that's incomprehensible to Peter. We just saw that. And so it becomes part of the narrative of 16 chapters to try and articulate how there could be merit, how there could be something other than dishonor and shame, how there could be honor and glory in a suffering and dying Messiah. So Mark is doing what Paul is trying to do. He's trying to interpret and give meaning to this ignominious, shameful death of Jesus on the cross. And he's going to do it by way of acknowledging that Jesus is going to be raised by God and is going to be declared by others, particularly pagans, Son of God. Thank you.